Hello, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I finally got to have a dialogue with one of my favorite physicists, an old colleague and friend, Lenny Susskind, who has played a key part in many recent developments in theoretical physics, and has also written some wonderful popular books and semi-technical texts that I think are extraordinary. Lenny is a fascinating scientist who, as we talk about, began life as a plumber in New York City and moved on to become a theoretical physicist at a time when theoretical physics during the 1960s was changing dramatically. And he was involved early on in efforts to actually understand and develop what was the original form of string theory. And he worked on the theory of the strong interaction, trying to understand the nature of quarks and what confines quarks, and then the origin of matter in the universe, and then ultimately to the current controversies which are driving much of theoretical physics, involving both the apparent paradox of black hole evaporation, which appears to defy the laws of quantum mechanics in some clear way, and has produced a paradox that a great deal of the community has been trying to solve. And also this remarkable notion of holography, the idea that perhaps our three-dimensional world really could be codified simply by a two-dimensional surface, just like a hologram, a plate, codifies the three-dimensional information. When you look through a hologram, you can see, as you move your head, you can see behind objects. Well, it's become clear in theoretical physics that it's possible that what we mean by dimensions may be to some extent an illusion, that in particular related to black holes, but also to our universe itself, that a universe in 4 dimensions with one kind of physics could be equivalent to another universe that is 3-dimensional with a different definition of physics, but the laws essentially and what happens would be remarkably the same. It's a fascinating idea, and Lenny's been at the forefront of that, as he has been many ideas in science, and it's a pleasure to talk to him. He has a down-to-earth way of describing things and an extremely clear viewpoint that I think will elaborate for many people listening to this, many of these current controversies. At the end of the podcast, we got to talk about his writing, and in fact, behind me, right, if I could point right there, are 3 of his books called The Theoretical Minimum, which are great books for young science students who want to basically try and read and understand the basic mathematics and physics that you need to understand sort of modern physics. All in all, it was a great opportunity recorded on Lenny's 85th birthday, I believe, and I was really happy that he took time out to talk to me. I think you'll be entertained and educated by this discussion, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. You can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack site, and the dues for that go to support our nonprofit foundation, the Origins Project Foundation, that produces this podcast, or you can watch it on YouTube, and I hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel if you watch it there, or listen to it on any standard podcast listening site. No matter how you listen to it or watch it, I hope you enjoy this podcast with a leading theoretical physicist, my friend Lenny Susskind. Well, Lenny Susskind, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've wanted to have you on for so long. It's really nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Lawrence.
And I will say that, and it will date this, but happy birthday, happy Father's Day.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking time on this. Very special.
But I'm not your father.
Well, it doesn't matter. All fathers should have a kind of common bond, I think.
I guess so, yes.
Yeah,
and happy Father's Day to you, too.
Thank you very much. As you may know, this is an Origins podcast. So what I like to do is kind of find out how people got to where they are, where we then proceed to find out the things they've been doing. And I've known a little bit about you. I mean, I've known the lore about you, but I want to find out more than the lore. I want to find the reality. So I heard about the plumber stuff early on, but so you grew up in the South Bronx, and when I look at
South and East Bronx, Far East Bronx, yeah. Little Italy. Well, it wasn't really Little Italy, but mostly Italian and Irish.
Interesting. So let me ask you this question. For some reason, when I look up various biographies, it said brought up in a Jewish family in the South Bronx. Was your family like Orthodox or anything, or were they?
No. They were all a bunch of far leftist, Communist Party members.
Excellent.
Union men.
Yeah, union men. Your father was a plumber, am I right?
Yeah. Yes, he was. But plumbing in those days was a different profession than it is now. Still plenty of lead pipe in New York. And
Yeah, so now there's a noble tradition of plumbers from New York in physics, of course, because our joint friend Shelley Glashaw's father was
that's right.
I don't know, he's a little older than you, but I don't know if his father knew your father at all, or
I asked him once, and he really had no idea.
Well, one of the differences between him and you is that you actually went to work as a plumber for a little while.
Did for 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years. So okay, we'll get there. Okay, that's what I was wondering. But first, so your father was a plumber. He had no. I assume he had no. Did he go beyond high school? Did he have any?
No, he got to the 5th grade.
5th grade. Okay.
The family was incredibly poor. His father, as I said, was a leftist in Russia, anti-czarist. When he came to the United States, I don't know exactly when, maybe 1898 or something like that. He went to work as a house painter. He was a union man, but he was also a gambler, and not a good gambler. He made bad deals. Card player.
Yeah.
Family was incredibly poor. At the age of 12, my father's family got thrown out onto the streets outside the apartment building, and he had to go to work. So the situation was, in those days, what was this? It was 1918. In 1918, a poor Jewish boy who had to go to work, there were really only 2 options. You could join the gangs, or you could be a good boy and go to work in whatever profession, which generally meant building professions. My father was a good boy. He was a very good boy. He loved his mother. He loved his sister. I'm not sure exactly how he felt about his father. He went to work as a plumber, but a lot of my upbringing centered around the fact that my family worried that I would do the opposite, that I would get in trouble.
Oh, I see.
So
I can see that worry, knowing you. Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it was just an overreaction on my parents' part.
So he was grade 5. What about your mother? I don't know anything about your mother.
Grade 9.
Okay, so where did you get your interest in science?
That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure. First of all, to say that my father had a 5th grade education would not be accurate. He and his friends, his buddies, who were very similar to him, plumbers, some Jewish, some not Jewish, they were in their own way intellectuals. They would sit around the table in my father's house. My father was the leader. He may have been the oldest. And he had this bunch of friends, and they would sit around and talk about all sorts of things. They were all leftists, so we'd talk a lot about politics, about history, but science also. The trouble was they didn't have any real way of knowing what was real and what was fake. So sometime around the age of 12, my father's friend, Moshe Dursky was a real character. Somebody ought to write a book about him. But he gave me this book, Worlds in Collision.
Oh, I know the book. Yeah.
Yeah, Velikovsky or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was completely fascinating. It was fascinating about how the world got to be the way it was as a consequence of a collision, I think, between Mars and the Earth or something like that. I don't remember. It was very, very fascinating. I remember reading it and talking about it with Moshe. I had no idea that this was complete crackpot stuff. How do you tell? I mean,
yeah, when you're a kid and someone gives it to you,
Sure enough, Mars has cracks on it, or at least it looked that way to some astronomers. And if I remember, I think that was my first real exposure to something that resembled science.
Right, yeah.
But the other thing was, I was good, and the only thing I was good at in school, the only thing, was math. I'm not generally considered a very mathematical physicist, but I was very good at mathematics.
Did that just happen? Was there any interest in? Did you just find the math easy? I mean, your mother or father never.
I found it easy. I found it easy, and I found it satisfying that I could do it better than anybody else.
Yeah. I know
from about the 5th grade through what was called junior high school in New York, I was very good at it, although I was generally considered a very bad student.
So you weren't at the other subjects, you're telling me?
I was terrible. And I don't know why it was so bad. I had terrible experiences in English. I write well. I'm a good writer.
Yeah, we've written lots of things. You are a good writer. In fact,
I'm a good writer, but I've been told by good writers that I'm a good writer.
Yeah.
But why I was so bad at it, I don't know. In any case, throughout high school, the only thing I was good at was math. I was so bad in the other stuff that I was forbidden to take in physics. Now, that doesn't make any sense, but it was true. When I was ready to go to college, the high school sent a letter to the college saying this man is not suitable for college.
Wow.
The only way I got into CCNY, in the engineering school, was there was a standardized test, a citywide test, and it was mostly mathematics. It was for engineering school, and I was number one in the city.
By the way, for listeners, CCNY, City College in New York, I was going to ask what caused you to go there. And you went there presumably because you couldn't get in anywhere else, but given your high school record, or you never thought about it?
Yeah, I never tried to get into anywhere else. The plan to go to college, my father had a great idea. He had a brilliant idea. In the New York City tenement buildings, the heating systems were failing. They were old. They were 19th century heating systems. They were failing. And he had the idea that he would go into business replacing the heating systems. These are giant boilers, coal-fired boilers. He was going to replace them by oil-fired boilers. It was a brilliant idea. It would have made him a load of money. The problem is he didn't know anything. He didn't know enough engineering to do it. Now, this wasn't true. He really did know enough. He had enough seat-of-the-pants understanding of how heating systems work. But to do it, you had to interact with the engineers and so at some point, he got frustrated because he didn't know what a BTU was. British Thermal Unit.
Yes.
So his idea, which is what heating systems were measured in those days, maybe still, he said, you got to go to college, study a little bit of engineering, and then you'll be able to do that side of it.
I was going to ask if your parents encouraged you. They never wanted, like, my parents wanted my brother to be a lawyer and me to be a doctor, but your parents didn't want that. Did they ever talk to you about that kind of stuff?
Not a lot, but it was just assumed that I was going into my father's business. My father had a very, very, very small business. So it was quite a shock to the family when they discovered I wasn't going to do that.
Okay, but I see. So the idea is you're being encouraged to be an engineer so you could make the business, you could bring the business to this massive new money-making scheme of.
It would have worked. It would have worked. We would have made a lot of money.
But your father got ill and you actually started working as a plumber when you're 16. So does that mean why?
No, I actually started working before that. The reason was not that my father was sick. When I was 14, maybe 13 or 14, I started having to go to work with him. He insisted, and he was a tough character. This was not somebody you told no to. He was a tough character, and he said, you got to work. Okay, so I came to work with him. And what was the reason? In retrospect, I realized it was to keep me off the streets.
No, that's smart.
It was to keep me off the streets, which didn't work too well, but it was to keep me off the streets on Saturday afternoon. So from about the age of 14, I started working with him on Saturday afternoons and in the summer. The summer I had to work all summer long. But then at the age of 16, when I was 16, he was 50, his heart started to give out, and he really did need me. So from that time, after school, every day, Saturdays, Sundays we didn't work. All summer long, all holidays, I was doing full-time plumbing.
Now, what about when you got to college? Were you doing plumbing then?
Absolutely, completely. Was married very young. I had a child while I was in college. I needed the income. My father's needed his business needed me. So yeah, I was working pretty much full time, easily 40 hours a week.
That's one of the virtues, I guess, of having a child young, is your great grandfather.
Sure.
So you're working full time, essentially full time, while you're going to college, studying engineering. And they didn't at that and City College didn't require you to take these sort of English classes or anything like that. Could you?
As an engineering student, it did not.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Right.
Now, but then you somehow went to the dark side and discovered that you wanted to do physics rather than engineering, which is a reasonable thing to do, of course. But how did that happen?
Well, look, I've told the story so many times. It's a true story. It really happened. It's the only way I can explain it. I took the first genuine engineering course. Oh, no, the first genuine engineering course I took was thermodynamics.
Oh, wow.
It was thermodynamics of heat engines, all the really
good stuff your father wanted you to learn, in fact.
My father wanted to learn. The problem was I got stuck when it came to entropy. The guy told us that entropy is an integrating factor. I didn't know what an integrating factor was, but much worse than that, the so-called professor had no idea what entropy was. No idea whatever. And I tried to understand it. This was a mistake. Don't try to understand it. Just do it. I tried to understand it and got completely frustrated. It didn't mean I failed the course. I did well in the course, but I was completely frustrated by it. But then I took another engineering course that was mechanical drawing. Just mechanical drawing, gears. In those days, mechanical engineering meant mechanics and gears and cogs and axles and all that kind of stuff. And you had to draw, you had to make these drawings. Now, in those days, there were no computers. Mm-hmm. You made a drawing with a piece of paper and a pen. And the pen was India ink. And the pen was called a ruling pen. If you've ever seen a ruling pen, you know that it has two nibs that stick out, and you drop the ink into it, and it's held there by capillary attraction. And then you move the pen. And if you're as unsteady as I am sometimes, you wind up leaving blobs of ink on the paper. This is not allowed. Part of the class was to teach you how to use these pens. So at the end of the class, I had completed one drawing. The rest of the class had completed 5 drawings. And the professor, who ultimately became a friend, his name was Harold Rothbard. And he came over to me and he said, Susskind, I'm going to fail you in this class. I can't pass you. I said, Professor Rothbard, my father's waiting for me. My kid is waiting for me. My wife is waiting for me. We're going to go into business. I can't fail the class. And he said, no, I'm going to fail you. And I thought, this guy thinks I'm a real idiot. And then he said to me, he said, you're super smart. You have the mind of a scientist. You need to go into one of the sciences. I will help you. So the first reaction was scientists meant men in white gowns with test tubes. So I went to the chemistry department. The chemistry department says, no, it's too late. You have 2 years into this. Yeah, if you spend an extra 2 years, you can become a chemistry major, but you don't have any record of chemistry courses. Next, I went to the math department, and I ran into a guy, a professor, whose name was Jesse Douglas. You may not know the name Jesse Douglas, but Jesse Douglas was the first Fields medalist.
Oh, okay.
He's the man who solved Plato's problem, whatever Plato's problem was. He was completely crazy, although a very good mathematician. And what was he doing in City College? He had been fired from MIT, he had been fired from Princeton, he had been fired from all the great... Why? Because he refused to come to class. He considered the students complete idiots, not worth interacting with, and he wouldn't come to class. He came to CCNY, did the same things. But for some unknown reason, he took a shine to me, and he started giving me problems. They were easy problems. They were not hard problems. I would solve the problems, come to him, and he got sufficiently interested in me that he became my protector.
Oh.
But at some point, he had a very similar reaction to what Rothbard had. He said, you solve these problems in a very unusual way. You don't think like a mathematician. You solve the problems the way a physicist would solve the problems. Intuition, some sort of pictorial representation you have in your head. I think you should go to the physics department and talk with them. So that's how I got into it. I met a guy called Harry Sudak, who was a lifelong friend of mine. And he smoked a cigar. He came from the Bronx. I think he came from Washington Heights, which is culturally the Bronx. We started talking, and he told me something I didn't know. He told me that not all physics had been done 200 years ago.
A very important thing, yeah.
Right. He told me that you can make a living for the rest of your life being a physicist, that there are still physicists in the world, and there are still major problems of physics that are ununderstood. That was completely new to me. I had no idea.
It's a really important thing. I just want to jump in. I've often talked about it in high school. It was Feynman's book, The Character of Physical Law, that at first I thought, it's not all done by dead white men 200 years ago, and it suddenly changed everything.
That's an interesting comment, because one of the first books he gave me, I don't know how he got it. I think he got it from Eugene Wigner, who was a friend of his. Oh. It was a photocopy of the handwritten notes for Feynman's book, first book. And I started reading that, and wow, I was blown away. I was completely blown away. He started teaching me classical mechanics.
Wow.
And he himself was a good physicist, but he didn't know a lot. He was a CCNY teacher, which
Yeah.
meant, they were not, they were PhDs, but they weren't research physicists.
Yeah.
And then he said, you got to learn quantum mechanics. So I got out a couple of books on quantum mechanics. I got Bohm's book, which was incomprehensible. I could
Yes.
not get a word of it. And he finally said to me, look, I've been buying books, cheap books from Hong Kong. They're pirated books. Are you against pirated books? I said, no, I'm not against pirated books. I didn't even know what it meant. He said, I'm going to buy you a copy of Dirac's book.
I was going to say Dirac. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. He got me a copy of Dirac's book. I think I still have it somewhere. And I started going through it. And again, I was just blown away by it. The logic of it, the clarity of it. So I learned quantum mechanics. I learned a little bit of general relativity, and at that point, I knew there's no point in going back and get to engineering. I will never be happy.
And how long? Well, first of all of this sounds like it was done outside of class.
Yeah, it was completely outside of class. I did take some physics classes, which I did well at. I got A's in, and it was made clear to me that by the physics department that they didn't have much to teach me. Yeah, I was doing very badly in school. Again, partly as a function of the fact that I was working full time, partly of the fact that I had no interest in anything but the physics and the mathematics. At that point, since I was now a physics major, I did have to take English, I did have to take German, I did have to take all this stuff, and I was failing everything. The dean would call me in every quarter. It wasn't quarter, it was semester. Every semester, and tell me, what are we going to do with you? You failed every course again, but the physics department won't hear of us dropping you out of school. So eventually, the dean, together with a couple of the physics department people, managed to make contact with some graduate schools and got me into some of the graduate schools without a undergraduate degree.
So you never got an undergraduate degree?
I did after I was already a professor at the.
Oh, okay. Because I read something about you graduated in 1962 with a degree
I
in physics.
graduated. I graduated from CCNY.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I finished CCNY in 1962, but I didn't graduate.
Oh, they lie. It says somewhere in your biography that you graduated with a degree in physics in 1962.
No, the degree came from 1966 after I already had a PhD.
This explains another thing. But before we get there, so now pieces are beginning to fit together. At some point, you had to tell your father or your parents.
Again, a story which I have told more times than is healthy for me. But the story, again, is true. Once I realized I wasn't going to be an engineer or a plumber, I had to tell my father. As I said, my father was a very, very tough guy. Not tough in the sense of, just an inner core that was immovable. He was not a big man. He had hands that could crush walnuts with one hand, but the rest of his body was not very big or strong. So I was living in a different section of the Bronx than where my father was, with my wife, with my child. And I said to him, Maxine, look, I got to go tell my father. This is. And I was scared of him. He was my hero, but I was also scared of him. And so I got in the car with my wife, with the kid, and drove over to my father's place. And he was in the basement cutting out pipe for the next day's job.
Sure.
And I went down and I said, Benny, I'm not going to be an engineer. And he never used foul language. He did not like foul language. It was once in a while, very rarely. But he said to me, what the fuck are you going to be? A ballet dancer? Okay, this was the fifth grade, deep inner city Bronx character.
Yeah.
What the hell are you going to be? Hill wasn't what he said. What the hell are you going to be? A ballet dancer? I said, no, I'm going to be a physicist. And he says, a physicist? You ain't going to work in no drugstore. He didn't know physicists, he knew pharmacists.
Yeah.
I said, no. And by magical luck, I said the right words. I said, no, a physicist like Einstein. My father was educated enough. He had enough knowledge of the world to know what and who Einstein was. He didn't know what Einstein had done. But, to Jews in New York, Einstein was the golden name.
Yeah, it was golden around the world.
He just stopped and he thought a minute. I can still picture it. It was a long time ago. I still can see it. He said to me, are you any good at it? And I said, well, of course, it's hard to tell, but I think I'm probably very, very good at it. He just thought a minute and he said, okay, you're going to be Einstein. I don't remember much after that, but my ex-wife told me what happened. She said she came in with my mother. My mother was crying. She was terrified that the baby was going to starve, that I wasn't going to be able to make a living. And she started crying to my father, and my father apparently just told her to shut up. He's going to be Einstein. And that was the end of it.
It was the end of it. Wow.
That was the end of it. After that, my father was on board completely.
Completely throughout the whole thing, even doing PhD, which would have been alien to him at the time, the whole idea.
Completely, yeah. Alien is probably not the right. Just think, knew nothing about it. He started to get out some physics books, elementary physics books, and tried to learn a little bit, which he did, but it was very hard. He was
yeah, sure, but that was nice.
Mid-60s. How old was he? Late 50s, I can't remember. It's interesting. My father was, it's hard to say, but he was a brilliant plumber. He had the capacity of diagnosing plumbing problems that was extraordinary. So I always thought that maybe some of whatever technical abilities I have came from my father. But then much more recently, after my father died, after I was remarried, my mother used to come to visit. And I had some experiences with her. I knew that she was very, very good at arithmetic and bookkeeping. That was her profession.
I was going to say she worked outside the house.
No, only when I was very young.
Oh, okay.
Before she was married, I knew she was considered brilliant at it, but it never occurred to me she was not an intellectual, not at all, and it never occurred to me that she might have these abilities. But then one day, two things happened. There was my kids had come my kids were there, my wife was there, and a well-known physicist had been visiting. He was an experimental physicist. I won't mention his name. And we were talking, and he asked me, well, my kid's good at this. And I said, I don't know, let's try some things out. And so I said to my kids, supposing you have a cube and it has a certain volume. They knew what that meant. I figured my mother has no idea what it meant. And I said, supposing you double the size of the cube, double the length of the cube on each side, how much does the volume go up? And my kids who were young didn't get it right. My mother instantly said 8.
Wow.
Where the hell did that come from?
Wow.
She had completely visualized it.
Yeah.
And saw that it was 8. And then later that night, we got in the car with this physicist in my car, and I had a helium balloon in the car. And I said to them, when I accelerate the car, which way is the helium balloon going to go?
Wonderful.
The physicist got it wrong.
Oh, yeah? Really?
My kids all got it wrong. My mother said it's going to go forward.
Wow.
And I said, why? And she said, because the air is going to push it backwards. I was flabbergasted. And I started to think, and I started to realize that on many occasions, my mother really had shown a certain intuitive concept for things that I really had never thought of before. So I suspect some of whatever talent I might have might have been inherited.
Yeah, your mathematical ability. Well, that's what I was asking about your mother earlier. I was trying to see if she ever talked to you, but she didn't talk to you. But obviously your genes did in some ways.
Well, something. So I don't know how much of talent comes from genes, how much of it comes, but I'm a believer in genes.
Well, they exist, that's for sure.
Yeah, but I was kind of flabbergasted.
It's wonderful to learn that. It's a shame, of course, you never had the opportunity to use it, but that's really interesting to learn. But I was going to ask, in terms of plumbing, do you think your experience as being a plumber, and picturing the mechanics of how it works, affected the way you think about physics at all?
No.
No?
No, I was not a good plumber, for one thing.
Okay.
My father was brilliant. I was not.
Okay.
But no, I don't think so. And in fact, I would say the opposite. Whatever abilities I have, picturing things and so forth, did not help with plumbing.
By the way, when I told him I wanted to be a physicist, my uncle said, you want to give physics? I don't know if you know what it's like enemas and stuff. He thought maybe.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so he didn't quite understand it. But this explains then why I was trying to figure why you did your PhD where?
Cornell.
At Cornell. So you got into it. You got it. So You must
Yeah,
have known enough to get it. I mean, you went from CCNY to Cornell, which is something. So your professors must have given you.
two of the professors there I was very close to. One of them was this fellow, Harry Sudak. He took me down. Oh, I had an interesting experience. He was a friend of Wigner's. He had worked in Oak Ridge with Wigner on whatever it is they used to do in Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
I won't tell you because then they'll have to put you in jail. He knew Wigner quite well. He decided to take me down to Princeton and see if we could get me into Princeton. Wigner was away, so he made arrangements for me to meet John Wheeler. So I went down to meet John Wheeler. My mother had me dress up but anyway, I went down there and I saw this guy who, the only thing I can say about him is he looked like a conservative. He looked like a Republican.
Yeah, he was.
And yes, he was.
Yeah.
But I was brought up to not like such people.
Oh, I see.
So my first reaction to him is it wasn't for political reasons. He just seemed like a very conservative, tight-laced guy. But he sat me down and he started to talk about physics with me. And before a half an hour, I was just completely enchanted by him. Completely. He was telling me about quantum mechanics. He was telling me about gravity. He was telling me about it from bit and wormholes and things. And I completely revised. I realized the guy was, maybe he was a conservative politically, but he was in the best possible sense a wild man when it came to physics.
Well, absolutely.
In the best possible sense.
In the best possible sense.
And my reaction was, boy, I want to be a student of Wheeler. But they accept me. So Cornell did through a professor of mine by the name of Arthur Bierman, who was a close friend of J.O. Rhea. J.O. Rhea was a professor of experimental physics at Cornell. They just accepted me flat out, no question asked.
That's nice. I
had one other offer from Columbia. I didn't go to Columbia for one reason. I knew that if I stayed in New York, I would have to do plumbing. My father would call me in the middle of the night, and if I got out of New York, it was the end of plumbing for me.
Oh, okay. I was wondering why you wanted to get out of New York, but that's a very practical reason. Well, that's fascinating. Well, I was trying to think where the Cornell experience. I now remember you'd gone to Cornell, but it was interesting because you wouldn't remember this. I vividly remember the first time I saw you. I was an undergraduate, but I was a very good student. My professors, there was an organization. It was like of northern upstate New York, and then there was some universities in Canada and they would have this meeting every year. And you remember that anyway? And I remember they took me.
It was Syracuse.
Yeah,
and also. Where was Marshall?
Rochester, maybe?
Rochester.
Yeah.
I think those were the origins of the Rochester meetings.
Maybe they were. I can't remember the name, but they would let me come down with them, and I remember.
Where were you? You were in.
I went to school in Canada, Carleton University.
Yeah, I know. Where
in Ottawa, Carleton University.
In Ottawa. Oh, I see.
And my professors all had gone to Cornell, by the way. Anyway, so they would let me go, and I didn't understand much, but I remember hearing you when I was there, and I would go listen. And you got your PhD pretty quickly at Cornell.
Very quickly. Yeah, 3 years. Yeah.
Why? Well, I guess I would have thought that given your background, which I figured must have been sporadic, if you were learning from your professors, that it might have taken you longer to get your PhD. But
no, I by that time I knew a lot of physics. I had really learned by myself, but But I learned the right way. I knew more than most of the incoming graduate students. I spent one summer. I was working but on Sundays I remember I would go to the beach in Rockaway, and I would carry a pad of paper with me and learn to calculate Feynman diagrams when I was undergraduate. So
Rockaway is a good place to calculate Feynman diagrams, isn't it?
Yeah, they're completely accidental.
I know, but it really meant
Rockaway.
Yeah.
I go there for the summers because it was too hot in New York.
Yeah.
So I had learned quite a lot by that point.
I think I know the answers. It's probably the same reason I did, but you already knew you sort of kind of wanted to do particle physics, or at least it wasn't. Yeah, at that point, which and what were your reasons?
Well, I wanted to do theoretical physics.
Theoretical physics and the fundamental stuff.
Probably. Yeah, I knew that I probably would not make a good experimental physicist. I liked the idea of it. I liked the idea of going into the lab and tinkering things. But when I actually tried it, I did not have good rapport with the apparatuses, let's say. I couldn't get the oscilloscope to oscillate. I could see nothing through a microscope.
So you did have to take labs as an undergraduate at City College.
I didn't, but still, as an undergraduate,
okay.
As an engineering student, I remember in one of the classes, engineering class, the class was called Strength of Materials, and one of the experiments we did was crush concrete and measure the strength of concrete. That I was okay at. I wasn't good at electronics. I was very good at the mechanical things. I was not good. I couldn't get the electronics things to work, but it doesn't matter.
And
I knew that my interests were largely theoretical and mathematical.
Yeah, well, since you had an aptitude in mathematics, in my case, I ended up doing a degree in math as well as in physics for the precise reason because if you did that, you didn't have to take the labs. So that was a way to get out of senior lab. But then I'm intrigued by why you went from there to Yeshiva, and I must admit I'd never.
Well, I went to Berkeley first for a year.
You went to Berkeley first for how long?
With an NSF, just for 1 year.
1 year.
The reason was not because I went there for 1 year, because at the end of the year I had an offer from
Yeshiva,
from David Finkelstein to go to Belfort Graduate School.
That's interesting. So you were in Berkeley 66-ish or something like that? Or?
65, 66, yeah.
An interesting time to be at Berkeley. Were you influenced by that was sort of Jeff Chu and that? Yeah.
Yeah, I was influenced, but in the opposite direction. I went there because there was all this activity going on in hadron physics and trying to understand it. When I got there, I was not enamored by this S matrix. I did not like that way of doing physics. The other two people who were there were Weinberg and Glashow. And I spoke some to Weinberg, some to Glashow, and I realized that the S matrix way of doing things was not what I wanted to do.
And they convinced it. That's interesting. I didn't realize. Yeah, they were both there for a little while. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. They were both associate professors, I think.
So now I want to sort of move into physics, because your career in physics is well, it's very wide and encompassing. But you started because the interesting questions at the time you were becoming a physicist really seemed to be about the strong interaction.
For me, they were about the strong interactions.
For all the good physicists I know, at that period, they seemed to be the strong interaction.
Well, of course, turned out that the weak interactions were pretty damn interesting too.
Yeah, I know. But what drove people at the time was because they're all the new particles, all the new stringly interacting particles. It seemed so strange and so different than everything else. I went back and read your paper on the structure of hadrons implied by duality from 1969. I thought I'd go back and look at it. There were a lot of phenomenological approaches, and for the listeners, that phenomenological basically means taking the data and building some kludge that worked, but it wasn't fundamental. But there were phenomenological approaches to dealing with this strange theory, the strongest force in nature, and someone had come up with a very nice way of understanding it, Veneziano, and you had, in that paper, you showed that you could think of it as what we would now call a string theory.
Right. That's exactly right. I was certainly not the only one, but it became fairly clear that these things we were calling hadrons, spell it out, protons, neutrons, and all their various relatives, mesons, things to which today we think of as composite quark systems. At that time, quarks were already being talked about, but they were only talked about. It was pretty obvious to me that hadrons were some sort of composite structures which could spin about their axis, which could vibrate and so forth. And that was experimental data. That was good experimental data, that you could take a proton and spin it up and make a thing called the delta 3 halves out of it, or you could cause it to vibrate. Unlike electrons. Electrons are really point particles. It doesn't make any sense to cause them to vibrate internally. So I had been thinking about how to represent them as composites of whatever. What was going on. I had some ideas, but the turning point, the pivotal event, was a friend of Yakir Aharonov, who I was very close to. We had worked on quantum mechanics together, not on particle physics. And Yakir's friend, whose name was Hector Rubinstein, you probably know the name. You probably remember him. At the time, he was at Weizmann Institute. Yakir was an Israeli. Hector came to visit us, or to visit Yakir, and he was incredibly excited this young physicist at Weizmann Institute by the name of Veneziano had invented a solution to the bootstrap problem, as it was called. The bootstrap problem was the problem of the Hadron S matrix, or whatever that means. And I didn't know what he was talking about. He jumped up and down, he ran back and forth, and he finally wrote a formula on the blackboard, which meant nothing to Yakir. It had 2 gamma functions in the numerator and 1 gamma function in the denominator. Very famous formula today, at least among the small group of physicists who know what it means, the Veneziano formula. And I looked at it and I said, that's it? That's very simple. I must be able to figure out what that means. I knew what a gamma function was. I was a good mathematician. And I knew that gamma functions had sequences of poles. Those poles would represent excited, rotational, vibrating states of whatever it was they were describing. I looked at it and I said, my God, the thing is a harmonic oscillator. It's a harmonic oscillator, for God's sakes. It's got equally spaced levels. I had also worked on what's today called lake cone quantization. I may have invented the part of it. And so I knew how to think about the Hamiltonian version of it. I said, this thing is a harmonic oscillator. And I went home and I probably spent a good month fiddling around. I did some problems of scattering things off harmonic oscillators. You know, you take a spring, you attach it to the ceiling, you put an electron on the end of the spring, and then you scatter a photon off it. I got things which looked awfully much like the Veneziano amplitude, although not quite. I wrote a paper that was called the Harmonic Oscillator Analogy for the Veneziano formula. It had the basis of those ideas. And while I was writing it, I suddenly realized that to get it to come out right, to really look like the Veneziano amplitude, it did not have to be a spring, but it had to be what we would now call a string. A string is just a lot of little harmonic oscillators connected together to form a chain. So I wrote that in as a comment added in proof that the right structure seems to be I don't think I called it a string. I think I called it a rubber band or harmonic continuum or something. I thought I was the only one in the world who knew that. I was sort of flying thinking, my God, I'm the only human being in the world who knows this. It turned out that there was one more human being who knew it. You probably know who it was. Nambu.
Yeah, Nambu, and then, certainly Nambu first. Yeah, Nambu knew a lot.
In some sense, when I found out that Nambu knew it, I was let down. I was disappointed. On the other hand, to be in the same league with the great Nambu, wow.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, he's a great scientist. Yeah. You know, when I look at your paper from '69, you do talk about strings already in there, and you also, by the way, talk about quarks. We've sort of jumped ahead, but really that's really fascinating. But the idea, what people don't realize, and well, some people do, but is that, you know, string theory grew out of this fascination this fascination and puzzlement about the nature of the strong interaction. It wasn't something trying to explain gravity or anything like that. Your interest, like many of the good theorists at that time, was in trying to understand the strong interaction. And that's what caused you to get interested in this whole idea, trying to explain these, you know, I would say, Veneziano, I guess I would say it's a phenomenon. It's a picture that gives you the right answer for some things, but it's really not fundamental.
Well, it was just a product of 2 gamma functions over a 3rd gamma. Incidentally, that was one hell of a brilliant insight of his.
Oh, sure.
He did not get the string idea, but that's an incredibly simple formula he wrote down.
It's great that we're getting into physics, but I do have this question for you. I think you told me, so David Finkelstein, I was wondering why you went to Yeshiva, which I'd never heard of. It wasn't a trajectory that a lot of people took, let me put it that way. And so, was it because it was a graduate school, or was it big?
Yes, I would not have gone to Yeshiva college to teach rabbis. All right. First of all, I had known David a little bit before that, and I knew how brilliant I thought he was. Then David Finkelstein is not a household name among physicists, but among some subclass of physicists who knew about him, he was considered very wonderful.
Yeah, he's a sharp, smart man.
Well, you know, I won't tell you what he did, but
I think I know. But anyway,
many beautiful, important things.
Yeah.
But for reasons that you are sort of suggesting, I was not at all clear that I wanted to go to this place. I said, "Who's there?" And he started listing the people who were there, whose names I knew. And I realized this was a very, very serious institute for theoretical physics. Aharonov, who I sort of worshipped as a master of quantum mechanics.
Sure.
Aharonov, Joel Leibowitz, whose work I knew in statistical mechanics, just Elliot Lieb. Elliot Lieb was a professor there at the time. And then they had made an offer to Dyson, who accepted the offer, incidentally, but then went back to the institute. He didn't want to live in New York.
Yeah.
Dyson was supposed to come there. Dirac used to spend a lot of time there. There was a famous astrophysicist by the name of Al Cameron.
Sure, I knew Al Cameron.
Who was there. And I realized, wait a minute, this is a serious place, as it truly was.
Was there an attraction to go back to New York too, or no?
No, only insofar as I was beginning to think about getting a job. And, I wanted to get my career started. I wanted to get my family. I had a family. I wanted to get my 2 kids by that time. And I wanted to get settled. And
was the fact that it was kind of a faculty position attractive? When I finished my position at Harvard, as junior fellow, I had a lot of offers, and they were like 5-year positions, this or that. But I had a family and a young child, or at least I had a wife and young child. And I took a faculty offer at that time at Yale. Because I didn't want to sort of move around and have the kind of, Army experience. I wanted to settle down. Was the fact that the faculty offer?
Yeah. I didn't. Yeah, absolutely. That plus the fact I had only taught once. I had taught at Berkeley. I was a postdoc. I had an NSF fellow. I didn't have to do anything. But I asked them, could I teach quantum mechanics? Would it be okay if I taught? I wanted to try out my hand at teaching. I loved it. It was as undergraduate teaching. I really, really liked teaching. I recognized something which has been something in the rest of my life, that the only way I ever learn new things is by teaching them. The idea of being at a place and not teaching was not terribly attractive to me.
But this is a graduate school. Did you ever teach undergraduates or no?
Not there, no. Only when I came to Stanford a little bit.
Now, to get back, if I try and picture, I'm sort of trying to picture your career as I've sort of looked through, as I say, I've known you, but the history of what you've done. And it was the strong interactions, and it was which initially got you, into thinking in terms of what would now be called string theory, which was one of the key ways of thinking about the strong interaction, which sort of ended with the development of asymptotic freedom, with the discovery that good old quantum field theory could.
Well, I don't think that's correct. Half the question is what happens at very high energy. That's asymptotic freedom. The other half of the question is what happens at very long distance. That's called confinement. They're not the same thing. Strings and the idea of flux tubes and my experiences with lattice gauge theory and that sort of thing.
Well, I want to get to lattice gauge theory. I mean, because as I look from strings, you move to lattice gauge theory. I guess what I want to say, to be more clear, and I think maybe you'll agree with me on this one, but it's good if you don't, is that part of the confusion of the 1960s and going to string theory, going to bootstrap, it was the belief that somehow quantum field theory was not going to work. At least what asymptotic freedom changed was the realization that a quantum field theory of the strong interaction was the right picture. Now, whether the tools of conventional quantum field theory would be useful, where a different thing, but at least it changed the perspective that you didn't have to give up this notion of quantum.
Well, I do agree with you, but I would say it wasn't the whole story. I would say the sea change happened before that. It happened as a consequence of the deep inelastic scatterings
at SLAC, and
SLAC.
So they know these were experiments that somehow showed when you looked in the proton, there were fundamental objects, and they didn't seem to be interacting with each other.
Or not strongly.
Not strongly, and that was.
But it did indicate that there was some substructure there. The substructure point-like. In the hands of Feynman, who had a very and Bjorkane, became clear that there was this substructure of point-like things, which, if anything, were more like electrons than like protons and neutrons.
Yeah, no, and of course that was the key thing. And I think when I first heard you were talking about, the first talk I heard from you was probably on lattice gauge theories, which I didn't understand at the time. So you were still focused in trying to understand how to understand the strong interaction, and indeed. how to understand this other remarkable feature that we don't see quarks, that they're
Yeah.
confined, and we
Yes.
still don't have a fundamental understanding. We have a numerical understanding, but
Well, I think we have better than that. We have a clear picture, and the picture from all directions comes to the idea that when quarks separate, strings form between them. That was the link. The lattice gauge theory told you that when you separate two quarks, string-like objects, which look like the same kinds of strings that we had been exploring earlier, form between them.
well, is that what got you into I was going to say, why how did you,
Nope.
was it make the transition from doing this kind of S matrix duality string-like approach to strong interactions to think about something very concrete, lattice gauge theory, which is, by the way, saying we'll make space discrete, and we'll put particles and fields on these discrete points, and it will allow us to do calculations we might not be able to do, and also ultimately later on numerically do things that we couldn't do otherwise. But what would cause you to make that transition?
Kenneth W. Wilson.
Okay.
Ken had invented a version of lattice gauge theory. When I first spoke to him, he actually had some wrong ideas about what the confinement was saying. He thought there was a phase transition of a certain kind that can't exist there. But he showed me this picture that what are now called Wilson loops are filled in the area between them, this area law, whatever the area law was.
Yeah.
I looked at it and I said, Ken, you're talking about strings. He said, strings? I said, yes. What you're telling me is that the lattice gauge theory is telling you that when you separate quarks, strings form between them. He went back and looked at some papers on strings. I have been visiting Cornell. I've been visiting Cornell. This was long after I bounced through that.
Yeah, he wasn't a professor. Was he there when you were a student?
Yeah, he was there. He was there, and he was doing his work on lattice gauge theory. And he got very excited. He started to learn a little bit about string theory. And he said, yes, you're right. That's the picture. These long thread-like things are forming between the quarks. And I went home and said, I would like to think of this not from his Euclidean path integral formulation, but I would like to formulate a standard quantum mechanical, what we would call Hamiltonian theory of gauge theory, which I did with John Kogut, and that made it extremely clear that what was happening was that there was closely related to the picture that hadrons are strings.
I thought you might have just thought of it as a new tool. I mean, lattice gauge theory, and your version of lattice gauge theory is so essential way of understanding, which we now use in as I say, in a lot of numerical simulations. But
well, let me go back a step. I had already gotten interested in gauge theories. This was the question that arose, the paradox which arose, because up until the early 70s, it was assumed that every quantum field has a particle associated with it. Every elementary particle has a quantum field, and they're in one-to-one correspondence. Here were these things called quarks, and it was getting pretty clear. Quarks were the right idea. My early 70s. But there were no particle-like real things in the laboratory. This was a violation of this one-to-one correspondence between fields, quark fields, and particles. I saw it as a bit of a paradox. I began to realize that this could happen in gauge theories. So John Kogut and I wrote a whole series of papers on what is called a Schwinger model, 1+1 dimensional electrodynamics, in which we showed this phenomenon of confinement happens. So I was already on the wagon, not my drinking habits, my physics habits, but I was already on the gauge theory wagon. I recognized that what was happening in this 1+1 dimensional theory is that these strings were forming between the charged particles. And it was just about at that time, when we had finished writing all these 1+1 dimensional papers, that I came into contact with Ken. I already knew Ken. He explained this picture from the lattice gauge theory, which just, it meshed completely with the earlier pictures, strings forming between quarks.
Was this before asymptotic freedom or after?
No, it was at exactly the same time. I remember exactly when it happened. I was visiting CERN, Sidney Coleman was at CERN, and Sidney was a friend of mine. Sidney didn't like me very much, but never mind. And Ken Wilson was there.
Oh, okay.
This was a meeting of 3 people. This was 1973. Asymptotic freedom had just barely come out, and he told me about it. Okay. And he, of all people, had the right idea of what it meant, that it would hopefully someday explain how confinement and freedom can coexist.
Yeah.
Ken was there. I talked to him separately. I don't believe we, all 3 of us, interacted. Ken told me about lattice gauge theory, and bang, the whole thing was just coming together.
Oh, okay.
So this was 1973, the beginnings of asymptotic freedom, or at least the beginnings of the fact that people knew about it. Of course, it was at least a year old that a Tuft had also discovered it. And of course, Ken Wilson also was one of the fathers of renormalization group. So he also understood very deeply the meaning of the asymptotic freedom.
Absolutely. If anyone would.
I think the interaction with those 2 people, Sidney on the one side, Ken Wilson on the other, just, made it clear what was going on. String, long flux tubes forming between quarks.
Yeah, and we should say for, again, listeners, okay, Ken Wilson won the Nobel Prize for trying to exactly understand how physics theories evolve at scale and use these examples to try and to formalize and quantify what he was doing. And Sidney Coleman, who, while he didn't win Nobel Prize while I was at Harvard, was probably the smartest person there. Okay, so you're still focusing on this on QC on strong interactions. Did you ever do any work on the weak interaction, by the way?
Yes. It ultimately failed. The work was called Technicolor.
The field moved and it was the heyday in the mid-1970s, where before that we didn't have any. We knew we had one quantum field theory that worked, electrodynamics, and by the end of the 70s we had one that we understood 3 of the 4 forces of nature, all by the same kind of theories. And there was a lot of interest in that. And your career, of course, as all good theorists, followed that kind of evolving interest. It seemed to me, and again, I'm just looking at this from a distance, that your background thinking about the strong interaction clearly influenced you, because the big question with the other theory, this electroweak theory, is that, well, we now call it the Higgs particle, and that there would be something that would basically have the symmetries of nature would change. There'd be a background field throughout all of nature. But you gave a potential solution, which really was a harbinger of exactly what had happened in strong interactions. So why don't you talk about your thinking about Technicolor and the weak interaction?
Okay, so by that time I was already, at least I was at SLAC, and it was about the time when I became a Stanford professor. The fact that I hadn't worked in weak interactions didn't mean I wasn't interested.
Of course, yeah.
I absolutely got interested in Higgs phenomena, all that went into Weinberg's theory and so forth. Probably as a consequence of my knowledge of strong interaction physics, I realized something that apparently nobody else had really realized. If there was no Higgs sector, then we would say, okay, electrons don't get mass, no masses for particles because it's the Higgs particle. It's not true. There's chiral symmetry breaking in the strong interactions, which leads to a symmetry breaking which parallels the same symmetry breaking coming from the Higgs phenomena. What is true is that would be enough to give masses to the quarks, leptons, the usual story, except 1,000 times too small. 1,000 times too small, because the scale of strong interactions, the scale of pions, the scale of chiral symmetry breaking is 1,000 times smaller, weaker.
Let me ask you a question, just to give people a sense. I've talked before that when a symmetry of nature breaks like that, when suddenly there's something that and that's the simplest thing to think of as a background field, particles propagating in that field can appear to be able to get a mass, and sort of in chiral symmetry is kind of like that. But when you say that chiral symmetry breaking happens in the strong interaction, gives the quarks masses, but you say it would feed into the leptons as well?
It would feed into the leptons in exactly the same way as it does to the Higgs story.
And leptons are electrons and muons and things like that.
Yeah. And so it was sufficient to break the symmetry in exactly the right pattern except 1,000 times too weak, which meant that the electron, the quarks, their masses would be 1,000 times too small. So I remember sitting in my office at SLAC, and I said, hey, wait a minute. All we have to do is create a new sector, which is very much like the ordinary strong interactions, let it break chiral symmetry in exactly the same pattern, except at 1,000 times higher energy scale. I ran out of my office, I ran over to Burkane, and I told him, I said, by that point, I instantly understood how the thing would work. Mm-hmm. And he got very excited. He said, that's got to be right. That's got to be the way it works. I don't know if people know who Burkane was, but Burkane was another character who was one of the great physicists of a generation, half a generation ahead of me, sort of.
Yeah. BJ, we call him. And not only did we of us learn field theory through his book, but I got to know him well. Yeah, and he had many seminal ideas, but
he was a giant, not only in physical stature, he was close to 7 feet tall, but
he was an intellectual giant, and in so many ways, and unsung, and in a way he kind of liked that, and I talked about that later.
Yeah. Sydney had also been visiting SLAC. He got excited about it, and
but it smells right. I mean, it
smells right.
It takes the physics that we exactly know and just a new sector, and then you solve all these problems. So it's one of these things where you'd think nature would do it, but it didn't. Yep. And I often talk about that to people. They don't understand, especially since, some people talk about things like elegance and theories. The wonderful thing about physics is you can have an idea that's beautiful, and that is certainly a beautiful idea. But if nature doesn't do it, you just throw it out. And it's the great liberation that science offers people, is to take an idea that they find so beautiful they think it has to be true and be willing to say, it's not.
Well, I was probably the first person to let it go. I knew it wasn't working.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. I knew it wasn't working. I knew that they were having a very hard time coming to grips with the quark mass matrix. And at some point, I just said to Savas, who was my collaborator and all of that, I said, this isn't working. This is just not working. We're making a terribly complicated story by now. It's not working. We need to think of something else.
Yeah, it was started simple, and you had to have epicycles and epicycles. And
that's right. It was an epicyclic theory, very simple starting point.
Yeah,
planets move around the sun in circles, very beautiful and simple, and then it gets more and more and more complicated.
Some might say that of string theory, but we'll get to it. But I want to follow, because the interesting thing is, as I looked at your career, I mean, obviously, like good theorists, it follows the major developments in the field in interesting ways, and has taken you in interesting directions that I guess I never would have imagined when I 30 years ago. So Technicolor was a way to try and understand, use what you knew about the strong interactions to understand this puzzle of the weak interaction. But at that same time, there was the heyday that you had these three forces in nature that we understood, and we understood in the mid-1970s this remarkable result, discovered a bunch of different ways that the strong interaction gets weaker, the electromagnetic gets stronger, and if you go to some extremely small energy scale, it looked like all the forces might unify, and that was
extremely large energy scale.
Yeah, extremely large. Extremely large. Sorry, small distance scale, large energy scale. Thank you.
Yeah.
Extremely large, 16 orders of magnitude higher, or at the time, 15 orders of magnitude higher than the mass of the proton. Astronomical, but physicists with their chutzpah, having just had the success of discovering three of the four forces in nature and how they work, were unabashed. And then it offered the possibility of solving a problem which I think many people beforehand didn't even think about. But it was the first example of where particle physics, fundamental physics, might explain something but the large-scale structure of the universe, and where people realize the very small and the very big come together. And of course, as you know, a lot of my career has been spent in that area. But I didn't know I should have, that you also got involved in this question of baryogenesis,
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Let me just say what it is. I mean, people, again, have heard it because I've talked about it in various contexts. But the idea is that we live in a universe which has matter and essentially no antimatter. And any reasonable universe, you would think, would have equal amounts, since they're the same mass and largely the same properties. And how could you start with a sensible universe that might have equal amounts of matter and antimatter and end up in a universe that would just have matter? That's this problem that goes by the technical name of sort of baryogenesis now. Right. And that was a big mystery, and and still is to some extent. But again, the leading theorists realized maybe there's the hope of actually addressing that if we really have a theory that has all the characteristics required to generate matter from an asymmetry in nature, and there were certain requirements which were known in early 1967 by Sakharov. It was incredibly exciting that you might answer this fundamental question about why nature was the way it was. So that got you interested, obviously.
Well, I think we answered it insofar as it can be answered at present. I mean, we don't know enough physics to be quantitative about it. Yes, Sakharov was there first, but nobody in the West knew anything about the Sakharov paper subject. It didn't exist at all. Bob Wagner came to me and asked me, do I have any ideas about why the baryon imbalance? Now, at that time, I knew very little about cosmology, so I had to learn some cosmology to even talk to him.
Yeah, sure. A lot of physics.
He's a master cosmologist, of course.
Yeah, Wagner was, I'm sorry, really
one of the smartest people. So I started to talk to Savas, partly Savas, partly by myself, partly with Bob. And I turned the question around in my head. Why should it be that there should be no? Why should the baryon imbalance not be there? Okay, so what are the conditions for which there will or won't be a baryon imbalance?
That's right. You rediscovered those conditions, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. The first reaction was that you need to have a violation of baryon conservation. If the universe in the very beginning, possibly because of inflation, started out with a very, very small imbalance between baryons and between protons and antiprotons, negligible, let's say, how could you possibly get something which had more baryons than antibaryons? It would require baryon number to not be conserved. To go from 0 to not 0 requires it to be not conserved. Well, by that time, I already knew that there were all sorts of important theories called grand unified theories, SU5 and all that stuff, which had baryon violation. And I still believe in that stuff, incidentally. The SU5 idea, I think, is probably at some level correct.
You say SU5 itself, that specific model?
Well, no, I mean...
That's grand unified stuff.
O10.
Yeah.
Yes, but with SU5 as a subgroup.
Okay.
With SU5 as a subgroup, I think something's right.
It's probably too technical for the audience.
But that's another question. I already knew that people were very definitely entertaining the idea that baryon number is not conserved, that the proton would decay over very long periods of time. So I said, okay, that's not a problem. The other problem is the second problem is the problem of symmetry between between electrons, between particles and antiparticles. But again, I already knew that empirically that symmetry is broken. It's called CP violation. I knew that there were phenomena, reactions, particle physics reactions involving K mesons, which were not symmetric under particles and antiparticles. So that argument went away, saying that there's no reason that there can't be an imbalance. And the final one, which I understood fairly early, was that if the universe is in thermal equilibrium, as a consequence of CPT invariance, it would have to have equal number of particles and antiparticles. But the universe is not in thermal equilibrium. And the early universe was expanding very rapidly and far out of that. So I just realized that there was absolutely no argument saying that that in the end of the day, after all this goes on, even if it started absolutely symmetric, that it would end up symmetric. And I made some quantitative arguments about it, quantum mechanical models and so forth, where you could see, given the three conditions, baryon violation, CP violation, and out of thermal equilibrium, it would inevitably wind up with an imbalance. And we wrote those papers. Papers were good papers. Later, I can't remember, there was two Russians came to me. And they said, we're writing a book about Sakharov. I knew Sakharov's name, but not through physics, through politics. They said, would you be willing to write for this book a chapter on Sakharov's work on baryogenesis. I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about Sakharov's work. They gave me the paper, and my mouth fell open.
Yeah, so
Absolutely, in 1967, he had all the right ideas. So, in fact, I wrote it and I circulated it, and that's how Sakharov's work got to be known in the West.
that's how people knew about it. Okay, I was wondering about that. For the audience, that's an amazing thing, is that at the time Sakharov wrote this, by the way, none of the, essentially, even though one had been discovered, essentially none of the ingredients that were required were a part of physics. It was fascinating, but it was all completely speculative. It's interesting how a decade later, all three of those things, as you just pointed out, the requirements of the universe could create a universe of matter instead of matter and antimatter, had all entered the physics lore. It's really a remarkable historical accident in a way. That
Yeah, I think what you're saying is morally true, but just as a matter of historical fact, which I think the CP violation had been discovered several months before. Yeah, no, a year, at least a year.
A full year before. I didn't know if Sakharov knew, given the way the Soviets are.
Sakharov did know. Sakharov did know. But I find it very impressive that Sakharov, just knowing that CP was violated, then moved ahead with all of this.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And then, but it is fascinating for people who wonder how one can get things like that, something from nothing, in a version of that. When you think about it from a fundamental perspective, we have all the ingredients. We haven't got the model, but no one's surprised anymore. It's just a matter of finding the details. I'm going to give maybe a biased historical development here, and I want you to correct me, as I know you will, Lenny. Well, there was the great chutzpah of the grand unified theories. It looked like everything was going to come together. We'd have a theory of all the forces in nature but gravity. It was only gravity left over to do, and that would just take a little time, and everything would be fine by the 1980s, and we'd all be happy and go home. But that didn't happen. But what did happen was that physicists, for the first time, honestly began to extrapolate, and with a solid theory of the Standard Model, felt that we could, in all seriousness, quantitative as well as qualitative seriousness, could begin to think about scales that were astronomically smaller in size or higher in energy than anything we can see. Then this fundamental problem, which has always been there but had been ignored because the scale is so remote, which is the scale where gravity and quantum mechanics might come together. And there was a small group of people, and I don't think you were one of them. Maybe you were, so you'll tell me if you were. In the wilderness, John Schwartz, there were a bunch of people in the wilderness thinking about resurrecting this idea, because what it was recognized, and it was, actually, you can tell me when it was first recognized, but a theory of strings naturally gives you a force that looks like gravity. And that maybe it would be a theory of quantum gravity. And of course, there were several mathematical developments in 1984, I think, that made the world, a large fraction of the physics world, decide that this was potentially the theory of quote unquote everything. But where were you how did you?
Okay, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to get background for people.
Okay. The fact that string theory, as defined rigorously through some certain mathematics, the fact that it had a spin-2 massless particle in it, I knew. I'm not sure if I was the first to realize it or not. I knew it. But I considered it a nuisance. I did not consider it a virtue. The hadron spectrum does not contain massless spin-2. I truly missed the boat on that.
Well, so did everyone. I mean, it took many years. Yeah, everyone was focused on the strong interaction, not gravity.
The one who first said, look, this could be gravity, and not only did he just say it because it was a massless spin-2 particle, he identified the gauge symmetry. He identified was a physicist by the name of a Japanese physicist named Yoneya, Tamiaki Yoneya.
Okay.
He wrote a wonderful paper just pointing out that string theory had the symmetries of a gravitational theory, the ward identities, we call them, and all that stuff, and pointed out that if you lifted the scale from 1 GeV to 10 to the 19th GeV, you suddenly have the theory of gravity. At the same time, I think it may have been just slightly later, the wonderful physicists John Schwartz and Joel Shirk, both who were incredibly brilliant scientists, had the same idea. I think possibly a little bit more from the supersymmetry perspective, but I'm not sure. They understood the same thing. They were much more in the center of the culture of Western physics, and everybody jumped.
Yeah, but it was a development, I think, that it was more than just knowing it was a theory of gravity. It was suddenly discovering that these things that seem to plague
Exactly.
these infinities that seem to plague things went away. That's when everyone jumped on the wagon.
Absolutely.
Look, after the fact, I know that you applied, we're going to talk about applying ideas from string theory to black holes and holography and all the rest, which you played a central role in. I kind of felt like you came into it from the outside, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, absolutely true. My interest in gravity, I understood, okay, this theory has gravitons in it. But, I was still interested in lattice scale. I was still interested in other things.
In the things you can measure in the real world.
Look, no, it wasn't that so much. What has always driven me is clashes of principle.
Okay.
When two things, both of which you have very strong reason to believe, disagree with each other. Quark confinement was an example. Every particle has a field. Every field has a particle. Yeah. Not working that way. I've always been driven by conflicts of principle. I understood that about myself a long time ago. The existence of gravity was troubling and so forth, but I regarded it as a major inconsistency or conflict of principle in physics. The conflict of principle that really drove me toward gravity was Hawking's paradox about information being lost in black holes.
Why don't you explain that? I've done it many times for people, so why don't you?
Okay. But it's not hard to say in a coherent and correct way. Well, I'm sure you said it in a coherent, correct way. First was Finkelstein, who recognized that black holes have a thermal quantity, a thermal aspect to them. They're warm objects. They're not cold. In other words, they have entropy.
Famous entropy.
Hawking did not believe that. And eventually had to do his own argument about it. Did some calculations involving quantum fields in the presence of a black hole, and discovered, yes, not only are they warm bodies having a temperature and an entropy, but they like any warm body, they will eventually evaporate away their energy. That would mean in the context of black holes that they just evaporate, get smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually just go pop and disappear as a consequence of the thermal energy that they have. But then a couple of years later, he came to a conclusion that undermines the basic validity of the principles of quantum mechanics. Why? Because that which goes into the black hole and can't get out, because nothing can ever get out of a black hole, it's prevented from getting out of the black hole by the properties of the horizon, will tell you that information means distinctions between things which might have fallen behind the horizon. What might have fallen behind the horizon might have been an electron, or it might have been a muon, or it might have been an electron with a spin up, or an electron with a spin down, or whatever. Those distinctions will be destroyed when the black hole evaporates. There will be nothing left to encode those distinctions. So what it says is that information or distinctions are erased by black hole evaporation. This may not sound like so much of a big deal to people, but it is a huge big deal from the point of view of the basic principles of quantum mechanics, also classical mechanics, incidentally, but quantum mechanics especially. Quantum mechanics says that nothing is ever erased. It cannot be erased. It's called the principle of unitarity. And it is so deeply ingrained in quantum mechanics that if Hawking was right, this would have been a major, major shock to the structure of the laws of physics as we know it.
In fact, that's a beautiful description of this paradox, which was known, from the 1970s. And as you point out, it's interesting that you say you're driven by these conflicts, but of course, physics has been largely too. I mean, Einstein, there were these fundamental conflicts that led to relativity, led to quantum mechanics, and now this paradox between two fundamental pillars, general relativity, one of the beautiful theories of the 20th century, and quantum mechanics, the other amazing theory of the 21st century. If Hawking's right, they don't work together. And that's profoundly, from a fundamental perspective, it's profoundly important. Let me at least step back and say, from a fundamental perspective, it's incredibly important. from a practical perspective, as you point out, it doesn't really matter for almost anything except for the beginning of the universe and black holes, probably. But from if you really want to understand the fundamental physics of the universe, that's the central question. Would you disagree with me?
Well, I have a feeling that if Hawking had been right, it would work its way into physics and you would find it reappearing possibly in measurable things. But that's beside the point. I've always been enchanted by a remark of Faraday's. Faraday was asked, "What's all this electricity and stuff good for?" And he said, well, he really didn't know, but he was sure the British government would tax it. Meaning to say, that which is fundamental at one time will turn up.
Okay. I don't think we'll ever. Okay, good. You really think we're eventually going to be taxed for quantum gravity? That'll be an interesting question. There were many great hopes of string theory in the 1980s when it looked like it was going to solve all the problems. One was it would produce a consistent theory of quantum gravity. Therefore, it should, if it was a consistent theory of quantum gravity, it should solve this paradox. It also should explain the properties of the world, like why we have this very small cosmos. It hasn't done that. Some people, and I think you're one of them, think it solves it does resolve the Hawking paradox.
I don't disagree with that, but I don't think so much that it resolves the Hawking paradox is it that it tells you there must be a resolution of it. String theory, and in particular in its form that's sometimes called ABS-CFT now, but it's a version, it's a particular version of string theory, makes it clear that there are at least some constructions in which gravity and quantum mechanics can coexist with pretty good mathematical rigor, and that there's something wrong with the argument that Hawking made, because in this context, we know that these two things do fit together. So it's kind of an existence proof that there must be a resolution, that there must be a resolution of this problem in which both of them can coexist together. I would say that is one of the main, what should we call it, triumphs or of string theory.
Contributions, certainly, yeah.
It produced a context in which those who had followed that line of reasoning would have to be totally certain that there was a resolution of it someplace. That's a completely different question of whether string theory is the theory of elementary particles and so forth. It's quite a different, and I have very strong feelings about that. To some extent, it's a matter of words. What do we mean by string theory? There is a very precise mathematical theory. That theory has won a number of mathematicians' Fields medals. Mm-hmm. It's very precise, it's very accurate, and it's rigorous. I'll call that string theory with a capital S. All right, it's supersymmetric. It fails when you try to make it not supersymmetric. It has exactly zero cosmological constant. It has a number of features which are different than what the real world has. So I can tell you with absolute certainty, string theory with a capital S is not the theory of what you call the real world. I can tell you that 100%. Now the question is there a theory which is sort of string theory inspired, string theory with a small s, which may be bigger, its boundaries may lie outside string theory level. We don't know. We don't know how to generalize it. We don't know how to push those boundaries away so that there might be things which are not supersymmetric, which don't have the zero cosmological constant. We don't know. And we don't know if string theory will help us find those things. When I said I have very strong feelings, my strong feelings are exactly that capital S string theory is definitely not the theory of the real world. And we are still uncertain about whether whatever it is, whether it can be generalized, boundaries pushed, string-inspired theories, we don't know. And I think that's the bottom line now.
Well, we agree. This is really neat because I thought we might disagree. We agree 100%. I agree with 100% of what you said. And that's my feeling. Some people think I'm kind of anti-string theory. I've never been anti-string theory. I've just been anti.
No, I mean it's not. It's a mathematical structure. You can't be anti-mathematical.
No, but structure. I meant no.
Saying I'm anti-Pythagoras' theorem.
It's well motivated and it may have at its heart something that inspires an understanding but we don't know yet.
People will say, oh, all you have to do is spontaneously break supersymmetry, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's been 25, 30, 40 years by now that nobody's figured out how to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Well, let me see if the other. Okay, so I'm going to put all these together.
Before I do that, let me make very clear that the existence of string theory with a capital S has been very, very valuable in this context of demonstrating that quantum mechanics and gravity can coexist. There's not been a failure in that. It has, whether it's been a failure in producing a theory of elementary particles, I would guess remains to be seen. But with a capital S, it's not the right theory.
Okay, no, you're right, and we should not mistake this. But so we're in agreement there. Now I want to see if we agree on the other thing, which I thought we would disagree about. I would say one reads, especially in the popular literature and also in the physics literature, sometimes the same people. Many people claim they've solved explicitly the Hawking paradox, and one reads this all the time. And I guess my attitude is that that because string theory gives in principle the statement that it's possible to resolve it, that the two theories can be consistent, there's hope. And there are lots of interesting ideas, but we still do not know specifically how to resolve the Hawking paradox. That's my statement, and I would have thought you would disagree, but maybe you don't.
What I would say is I don't think the last word about it has been said, but there has been a lot of very, very fascinating progress that's been made through the connections with quantum information theory, complexity theory, entanglement theory, and these are highly technical things. There was a very, very beautiful construction by Jeff Pennington, which I think goes a long way toward removing the tension between the quantum aspects. And they were motivated to some extent by string theory and then by ADS-CFT, but they stand alone. They stand alone as quantum mechanical constructions. The existence of things like quantum teleportation. Quantum teleportation is a magical thing which seems to take things through wormholes.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. All these things, I think, have contributed to a conviction that the problem can be solved, parts of it are solved, and the main outlines of the solution, I think, are known.
There are lots of interesting ideas that having to do with quantum mechanics and entanglement and effects at the horizon. And there are a lot of things being thrown at it, but I guess I'm more dubious about whether the statement you just made of the main ingredients or the main.
All right. Well, there's a difference between us. The difference between us is I have a proprietary interest in this. A lot of the ideas are mine.
Yeah, of course. No, and that's why I'm bringing them up, because a lot of the ideas yours, you played a key role in so many aspects of this. So I want to ask you then, if you think the general picture is the framework is there, describe it, because so that'll be useful. I want to hear what do you think is the likely general framework of the solution of a black hole paradox.
It's not that I can't do that. It's that I can't do that in 5 minutes
Here's the thing. Let me just tell you, Lenny, I want to get to two key areas that you've played a key role in that I know, and there are many key areas you played a key role in. But one is that this idea of holography, and the other is the idea of the landscape, which we'll eventually get to.
In this context of the Hawking paradox, the holographic principle is absolutely key. What it says in a highly unintuitive way is that all of the degrees of freedom of a system or contained within a region of space are located at the boundary of the region of space. That's highly unintuitive. We usually think of you're sitting in a room, I can see the walls, I can see your bookcases, the boundaries of your room are the walls, you're sitting somewhere in the interior. Your degrees of freedom are not on the walls of the room.
Uh-huh.
Your degrees of freedom are somewhere in the middle of the room. What the holographic principle says is that that's absolutely misleading. When you push things to the ultimate limit of Planckian physics, there is no more information in that room than can be encoded on the walls of the room in tiny, tiny Planckian pixels. All right, so that tells you from the beginning, from the get-go.
Yeah, let me step back for a second, just for the people. And the reason it's called holographic, and maybe you were going to say this, but the reason it's called holographic
Yeah.
is that in physics, and everyone's looked at a hologram, which is a plate, a two-dimensional plate, but when you look through it, you see the three-dimensional universe, and you can look around people, and it's a plate a two-dimensional plate that encloses
Three-dimensional information being encoded in a highly nonlinear way in a two-dimensional, what you call a piece of film, two-dimensional piece of film. In many cases, that two-dimensional piece of film surrounds the region that it's encoding. The early holograms were like that. And so that's a direct example of the ability of two-dimensional systems at a boundary to encode details of what's going on. All right, so that already told you that this idea that information falls into a black hole and can't get out, it can't be right, because the right picture is the black hole and everything else is encoded on the boundary of space far from the black hole. That idea that all of the dynamics, the information, in some sense takes place on the boundary of region of space is called the holographic principle. It's due to myself, it hoofed on myself. And I must say that when we first put this forward, I think a lot of people thought we have really lost their marbles.
Yeah.
Lost our marbles. That there went two good physicists, too bad.
Yeah, but Tuft is so ethereal that people kind of figured maybe he had, but you never see it that way.
Okay. But one of the people who got pretty convinced very quickly was Witten. Witten thought almost instantly, he asked me to come to Princeton and talk about it, which I did. And he was on board with this idea from the beginning. He understood why it was important, how it worked, as he always does. I cannot remember if Juan Maldacena was in the audience or not when I spoke. Probably not, but the whole thing didn't really get legs, as they say, until Juan found a very, very concrete example.
Yeah, I want to stop you here because I find this fascinating. You and Tuft had come up, had talked about. I mean, and it's not too surprising when you think about, the something called the horizon of a black hole. Lots of strange things happen at the surface. If you're standing in infinity, it looks like time stops there. So it's not too surprising to think somehow all of the information is encoded on the surface. And I think that's what motivated Tuft and you as well. Fascinating. So this idea that things would be embedded in one dimension less came from that very physical thinking. And then from a totally different perspective coming from string theory, while Maldacena a decade later, maybe.
No. Oh, sorry. 1993. Yes, more than a decade.
Yeah, see? Okay, I was right. Maybe more than a decade. But anyway, it was certainly totally well later, discovered an amazing property related to string theories that showed that physics thought one way. The world could be described by physics described with one theory in a certain number of dimensions, and with a very different kind of theory, exactly the same physics in a world with one less dimension, literally. And so, you can expand on that. But
yeah, let me just correct your history a little bit.
Okay.
The holographic principle went back to something between 1993 and 1994.
Yeah.
Juan's paper was 1998, so it was 5 years.
Oh, 5 years. Okay, it seemed like it was a decade, but anyway, it came from a
different place. Yeah, absolutely.
I would suspect it wasn't motivated by that black hole thing. It looked like it was completely motivated by mathematical properties of these things called conformal field theories and
D-branes. Joe Polchinski's D-branes.
Yeah, and properties of one of the things that string theory metastasized into, called M theory and branes. And so that's very technical mathematical stuff. And he had this amazing insight, which was a speculation. It looked like for certain very specific theories, you could show that the world could be described two equivalent ways with different numbers of dimensions. And so dimensions and one less than another, which is, of course, another way of thinking of a hologram.
Let's see. One is, of course, has very great talent as a theoretical physicist, intuitive talent. But he also, much more than me, has an ability to be precise quantitatively and mathematical. So his construction was so precise, so mathematically sophisticated, that it caught on instantly. People
Yeah,
recognized, yes, it
yeah.
has to be right.
People made songs
Whereas
about it.
as the whole holographic idea was much less,
It was,
touchy feely.
yeah, it was intuitive. I mean, I could read the papers. But it's
Yeah,
the thing I like actually.
yeah. Well, no, I think the arguments were solid. I think the arguments were solid, but ones were far more technically precise, rigorous.
I think that what your point you're going to make then is if all the information in the world can be encoded on a boundary that's one less dimension than the actual volume, then in principle that's the solution of the Hawking paradox,
In
essentially.
principle, I'll say that's part of a solution. Yes, yes. It is an essential part.
And so that's the idea, but how exactly is yet to be determined. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. It's still a bit mysterious and counterintuitive for sure. There are mathematical examples, n equals 4 superangles, blah, 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 blah. And this so-called SYK theory, where these things actually occur and where you can trace them through. But nevertheless, they are still rather mysterious.
Well, they're more than that.
I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you sitting in your room, and I'm saying you're in the middle of the room. You're not on the walls of the room. Nobody's going to you on the walls.
Rarely. But at the same time, it also reminds me of something you said earlier, the small s versus the big S. The cases where one knows one can use this mathematical construction are very specific cases which we know are not the case of the world in which we live. I think that's a fair statement. And so that's a significant problem. I mean, it motivates you, but they clearly don't describe the world in which we live.
That's correct. But on the other hand, they're enough to tell you that when anybody comes to you and tells you, I have a proof that information will be destroyed in black holes, you're permitted then to say, no, you don't have a proof because I have a counterexample.
I wanted to give people the sense of where we're at because they hear all the time in the media about black holes and rises and firewalls and all this stuff. And, they're fascinating ideas and they're being applied and lots of smart people are thinking about it. And there's lots of wonderful developments at the forefront of thinking about information and quantum mechanics and string theory. And it is fascinating.
And it may get taxed. It may get taxed as a consequence of quantum computer technology.
Okay, maybe that's the way. I was wondering where you'd say protect. Because some of these ideas, you're right, are extremely relevant to quantum computers. And some people would claim, and I think you actually are one. Well, there was a lot of hype about a quantum computing calculation that claimed to do something that I'm not sure with.
Those calculations. You're talking about the experiment.
Yeah, the quantum computing experiment.
Wormhole. What's the name? Experiment. Yeah, it's not a very good experiment. The experiment was an attempt to carry out a protocol that was invented by several people, myself included. But the protocol is a great protocol. The experimental implementation of it left more than a little bit to be desired.
It got a lot of hype, but anyway, and I told you what I'm always against is hype, not the ideas.
That got much too much hype, yeah.
And so my problem with string theory was in 1984 is the hype that it was immediately going to be a theory of everything. It was a fascinating idea, but it wasn't what it,
look,
that's all.
Look, people get excited.
I know.
They get enthusiastic. They get optimistic.
Absolutely. We're going to get to this near the end in a few minutes, in fact, because I don't want to get too long. But you like me, you write books and some of them in popular books as well as beautiful textbooks or semi-popular book. By the way, we'll get there. Do you see these 3 books here? Those are
theoretical minimum.
They're right there.
Read that.
Yeah, they're your books.
My eyes are so good I can actually read what's written on the wall.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, as you know, I've spent a lot of my life in sort of the public communication science, and I think what I worry about is we owe it to the public, I think, to be careful in what we say. And I understand we get excited, and it's fine for physicists to get excited with each other. But we have to be careful of what we say we can do, because if we don't, it'll come down and bite us in the butt.
Well, yeah, I completely agree with that. But on the other hand, there is a tension between that and the importance of keeping excited and letting the public know why we're excited. So there's a tension there.
Well, let's talk about the last tension, because and you invented the term, and probably at least for one of the people in the key ideas, and I don't know the history enough to know. Yeah, I heard it from a variety of sources, but a bug of string theory has been turned into a virtue in a sense. That
Perhaps.
string theory, people thought string theory would give this unique theory that, and in fact, it's exactly the opposite. It gives not just theories, it gives worlds and physics. Not an infinite number, but such a large number that it's probably infinite. And you might say, well, there goes physics because there's no predictive value and anything else. But what it's led to, and I think you were the first person to popularize it, but I don't know,
Yeah,
the first or not.
probably.
I read the paper on the landscape. You certainly coined the
Yeah.
word, noting that, well, maybe this bug is actually a feature because there's certain properties that are of our world that seem very inexplicable, and one of which is near and dear to my heart, since I guess I was one of the first people to propose it was there, was a cosmological constant, and it's an absurdly weird value that none of our fundamental theories, no one has any idea how to get that kind of number. But it could just be an accident. If there is if there's a string landscape, that means there can be. It means it's the opposite of what drove you and I into physics. Both you and I, I'm sure, got into physics for the same reason. We wanted to discover the theory of the world. We wanted to discover why the world had to be the way it is, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
And what we now discover is, well, and the worlds can be many different ways, and it just happens to be the way it is, if this is true. And why don't you elaborate? I'm talking.
Well, the only thing I would say about what you just said is evidently, as a matter of empirical fact, the world is much, much, much bigger than the portion we can see. To say that the world is a particular way, you're talking about a little bit of it.
Exactly. It's a myopic picture.
So
the universe, we used to call universe something very different.
Right. What these ideas of a landscape require, they require, I think. So there are three things that I think push you in that direction. The first is this fact that inflation theory tells you that the world is much bigger than the portion we can.
Yeah, I want to contrast the string landscape and inflation because let me tell you where I'm coming from, and then you'll be able. When people ask me about the multiverse, my response is what I happen to hold true. Inflation generically predicts a multiverse. So I view the multiverse inflation as incredibly well motivated from physics that we more or less can understand. The string theory landscape is another version of a multiverse, and it might be true, but I guess I hold it as less directly motivated. Do you agree with that?
The fact that there are many little sub-universes out there, that does seem rather well motivated from inflation. That whether or not they all have the same properties, that's a separate issue. They might all just, if there was only one solution of the equations, whatever the equations are, they might be string theory, they might not be string theory, with a capital T equations, if there's only one solution that allows only one kind of universe, then all of these little subregions will have to be the same, the same rules, the same empirical rules, same particle content, and so forth. If, on the other hand, the equations, whatever they are, have multiple solutions, 10 different solutions, 100 different solutions, which means 10 different possibilities for the particle spectrum, 10 different possibilities for the cosmological constant, then I think there would be every reason to believe that these different cells of sub-universes can and will be different than one another.
Absolutely.
The question comes down to whether the equations have multiple solutions, and if so, how many? If the number is huge, then fine-tuning becomes a new issue. If the number of solutions is so large that there will always be some solutions which have the properties that you're looking for, then we're in this funny situation. It's hard to be predictive from it, but on the other hand, the rules will tell you there are a lot of structures out there, only some of which make sense as possible habitable worlds where we can live. If that's really the case, I think we have no choice but to say our original hopes and dreams for a unique solution were just misguided. They may reoccur on a bigger scale of the equations. but we have to expect that the world that we live in may be just contingent, may just be a contingent property of a particular environment.
It turns physics into environmental science.
Well,
In a sense, yeah.
in a sense.
Now, let me ask you this question. So this is what, just for the audience again, it's often called the anthropic argument, which is the contingency argument you gave, is that the certain properties of our world may just be an artifact of the fact that they allowed us to be here to measure them. That if they'd been different, we wouldn't be here to measure them. It's not intelligent design. You wrote a beautiful book, I think, or at least an article, a book, arguing it had nothing to do with intelligent design. It doesn't. But it just means that it's, as I often say, it's like if an intelligent fish would ask the question, why is the world made of water? Because if it wasn't, they wouldn't be asked the question. It's a fascinating question. It's an open question. I think many people are on the same side of this, but I want to just check. One of the fundamental problems of particle physics is this weird thing called the cosmological constant, and why this energy of empty space is the value it is. If you were going to guess, do you think the resolution of that problem will be anthropic, namely an accident of nature, or that we'll have a fundamental theory that will explain why it is what it is? What's your guess?
I don't know another answer. I simply don't have another answer. This is a possible answer. It seems to me logically coherent. It seems well motivated, that the equations push you in that direction. And I simply don't have another available answer at all. So I would have to say, given all the available answers, which one is most likely right? There's only one.
Yeah, it's the only one available answer. And I agree with you completely. But historically, I will put in perspective, at least, there have been a number of times in physics when anomalous and weird quantities showed up, and arguments like this, an anthropic argument was made for the states of certain nuclear states and why carbon is produced in stars, and there were no reasonable answers, so people assumed it was anthropic. What's interesting is the minute a reasonable answer comes up, then the anthropic argument goes out. And so this could be another example. We're at a point where we don't know.
Yeah, look, I mean, what you're saying is the thing that worries me about this. There are historical examples where extremely compelling visions just turned out to be wrong. Any number of them, but ether is one of them. How can the world possibly have electromagnetic signals propagating through it unless there's some substance for them to propagate through? It was so compelling that everybody would have to believe it. It was wrong. Technicolor was so compelling.
I was going to say Technicolor is another example. I would argue, I think, I had many ideas that I thought were so compelling nature had to stop them.
However, I would say after a good number of years, 20, 25 years, however long it is, nobody has been able to produce a better explanation of what we see than this one. So it has to be considered a leading candidate, I think, just because there are no others.
Yeah, and let me say, let me ask you if you agree with this. I think everything I know about physics at a fundamental scale, from inflation and even string theory, but just leads me to think that there is a multiverse, that the multiverse is the most likely, that it's highly unlikely that our universe that we call our universe is unique. That's different than saying the solution of this weird problem will come from that. So you would agree with me that if your guess is that we live it's highly likely that we live in a multiverse. It's hard to imagine we don't.
Yeah, I do think that's right.
Yeah, and
yes,
and just for the people who, because I'm often involved in these kind of debates, some people think we physicists invented a multiverse, because we didn't like God or something, and this is our version. What I want to point out is that we were dragged kicking and screaming the multiverse. I mean, a lot of us would like the world not to have a multiverse and have a unique laws of nature, and I think we can agree there. We're a little bit of a
look. Where did it come from? Apart. It came once again from a conflict of principles, from things which we deeply want to believe, but which are inconsistent with each other. And something has to give. In this case, the speculation is that what has to give is the uniqueness of the solution of the equations.
And the uniqueness of our universe. And that is it has a noble tradition, because it's the ultimate version of the Copernican principle, that we're not the center of our solar system. We're not the center of our galaxy is nothing. And now we think our universe may be nothing special. And that's fine. For me, I find it I find it energizing and fascinating because it makes the accident of my existence even more precious. And the accident of the fact that I can have a conversation with you even more valuable. Before we end it, I want to spend the last 2 minutes. You've written popular things, and you've written these. I happen to love the theoretical. I just think those are real. Lenny, I read them, and of course, even when I understand the stuff, I find it has illuminated for me my thinking.
Well, that's high praise, Lawrence. That's high praise indeed. Thank you so much.
Sure, no, it's great. So what made you decide to do it?
I was going to tell you something which is kind of ridiculous. All of my life, I have been under the impression that I'm terrible at writing. This centered back to my experience as a young student in school where my English teachers told me I was terrible. I didn't believe it. I suspected that I had some talent at it. So at some point, I just said to my wife, I want to try. I want to try to write. The first books I wrote were the popular books.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The Black Hole War and the Cosmic Light. I said, I want to try. I want to see if I do have any talent at it all. I suspect I do. I had written a number of magazine articles for Scientific American articles that were well received. People liked them. And I'm going to try. I'll write a couple of chapters of a book. I wrote a couple of chapters of the landscape book, gave them to a friend of my wife who had been a professor of literature in the University of Washington, with a friend, Malcolm Griffiths. And he read it and he said, you are a good writer. You write well, but you have no concept of what it means to write a whole book. Books have to hold together. Chapters have to lead from one to another and so forth. And you're just chaotic. That was enough. He didn't have to tell me any more. I looked at it and I said, yes. And I got very intrigued by the problem of how you put a book together. How you put a book together and get it to cohere. And so to some extent, it really was just a curiosity of whether I had the capacity to do it. And it was fun. I got completely absorbed in it. I got absorbed in it. Most of my friends who wrote books about physics said they were so sick of it after 2 weeks that they just couldn't wait for it to be finished. I would wake up in the morning ready to start. And I would go through till 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. My wife wouldn't see me all the time. I was just completely absorbed in it.
Wonderful.
So I found writing very energizing.
Yeah, no, well, obviously, I can't say, I've written 12 books.
Well, you've done a lot of writing. So
yeah.
I don't know how much you enjoyed it, but
well, there are days when I don't, and it's very when you really have a hard time. I've always wondered in the end whether the most useful thing I would have ever done is my science or my writing, and I'm not up to me to decide, and I don't really care.
No, that's right.
Exactly. I don't really care. It's something. Yeah, it's both two things, and I value them both. I'm glad you've written, and as I said, I think the theoretical minimum is a brilliant idea, and it's a beautiful, it's a beautiful set of books that are semi-technical, but they're great. Anyway, I just think they're great. Thank you for this. I wanted a trip through your life is a trip through modern physics in many ways, and I enjoy talking to you so much. In fact, I'll tell you something. One of my sadnesses in life, there was a long time when I wanted to move to Stanford, and one of the sadnesses in my life is I thought if I could just spend every day talking physics with Lenny, my life would be better. So I'm glad we got to spend.
Yeah, that was fun. That was fun, and it was.
Thank you. I think the people I found it fun. I think people will find fun. I thank you for taking the time on your birthday and Father's Day to spend with me, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. And it'll be a great. I think it'll be a great record for people. So thank you very much. Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at origensproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at origensproject.org. Thank you.